Welcome to the How Humans Work podcast. I am your host, Jeffrey Salaji. So glad to have you here with us today. Season 2 is afoot, and we are starting another journey into human nature. This time we're looking at the role passages play in the lives of my guests, the initiations, the transformations, the accidental, the intentful. Hold tight and listen in, because we are about to journey into another incredible and beautiful series of conversations. Let's get into it. Here we go. Amy Armstrong, welcome to the How Humans Work podcast.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's really good to be here. I'm really honored. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here. I'm excited. In a certain way, this particular interview was random by chance because we ran into each other recently. I was passing through a neighborhood. You were in a situation and we got to interact there for a minute. But what happened for me is I'm like, I started to think about what I knew about you. And I started to think about the things I did know about you. And I began to realize that act of chance was actually really a bit of fortune, because I thought you would make a really excellent interview for this season around passages and the conversation around passages. As a high school teacher for 24 years at a private Catholic high school here in the Bay Area, I found myself being really curious about what you know, what you think, what your experience is in your professional life, working with young people, particularly at this point in their life where they are transitioning into their own sense of their adulthood, junior, senior years. And so I'm really glad you're here. And so big welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted and honored, and I've never been on a podcast before, so I'm excited, and also excited for you and this project that you've been running. You are in touch with your creative impulse and the feeling of being called to put something out in the world. I resonate with that also, and I resonate with the topic of passages. For me, I am in my 24th year of teaching. I've been teaching at this particular school my entire teaching career. And teaching has always been an extension of my activism. The first 19 years of my career, I taught a class in social justice and a class in peace and conflict studies. The peace and conflict studies course was my master's thesis. And over the last few years, I've shifted to teaching a major religions course and AP psychology. I've also taught moral philosophy fairly recently. The passage of a young person through adolescence into adulthood is already arduous in some ways, perilous even. In terms of the really pernicious effects of a misguided culture upon their identity formation and therefore their life choices. And at this time, I can only imagine the pressure and fear and anxiety that they're feeling in the face of not only a pandemic, which has upended education, but also climate change. I asked a couple of my classes recently if they follow the news, and some raise their hands. But I think it's got to be operating in the background. And so the absence of social, cultural support for that passage is of great concern. I think it should be of great concern to us all. There's an African proverb: the young person who is uninitiated, who is not initiated, will burn down the village to feel the heat. And so what I can say about the changes I've observed in the kids that I teach, some of it is by way of just data in terms of the spike in adolescent psychiatric issues, anxiety, depression, and suicide, and self-harming behaviors. but there's certainly evidence of, I think, what's probably a kind of an existential confusion, because on the one hand, there's a deep part of themselves that's longing to find themselves. They're in the phase of life in which they're forming an identity. But what the culture is feeding them through, say, social media, doesn't access the core part of themselves, their soul, if you will. And what the larger world is really needing also does not align with what the culture is feeding them about, either on the superficial level, or what's on TikTok or what have you, or even the sort of prescribed path. You're going to go to college, and then you're going to go to graduate school, and then you're going to get a job, and then you're going to have a family, and you're going to be a contributing member of the economy. Well, I mean, if the Gulf Stream collapses, we did see a rapid collapse of ecological systems and a tectonic upheaval ecologically and economically and politically, socially. So there's a way in which, and we're all sort of existing in that reality, right, where there could be change in the not too distant future that impacts us individually and collectively and existentially, in potentially catastrophic ways. So just to be able to wrap our heads around that is requires the stuff of myth, which is why I'm really grateful to be now in the realm of religious studies, where we can talk about what the world's wisdom traditions have to offer us at this perilous time.
Wow, that's a rich portrait of challenge and adversity for young people. And I agree that the world feels exceptionally precarious right now. And I'm curious with that, how you as a teacher, I was like, okay, there's a lot of different strands we could pull on here. But the main one I'd like to start with is, a teacher, how do you work with that condition as you see it? And you started to go towards wisdom and myth, but I'm curious what the weight of what young people feel as you see it, how it's showing itself, and then how do you find your way through that and offer some semblance, I think, of an antidote to the soulless part, an antidote to an economy that's not necessarily concerned with genuine identity formation as you placed it?
My approach, I think, begins in affirming that the wisdom actually is largely within them, that when they spend 3 hours down a YouTube rabbit hole, or Netflix, or TikTok, or whatever it is, or swept away by some sort of toxic conversational drama, they can feel it. They feel kind of toxic. And so just reminding them, just pointing out that wisdom, that knowledge, that compass is actually already within them, working. It might be difficult to discern, or it might be like really far, sort of, in the recesses of their consciousness, but they are of the age where they want and need to exercise autonomy. And so reminding them that they have agency, and that there is a wisdom within them that is capable already of discerning what is supportive of their well-being and happiness and what is not. And so the question is, what do we do with that, with the voice of that inner guide? How much access do we have to it? And do we listen? And do we act accordingly?
there's a kind of skills development in that, right?
I teach mindfulness meditation, and so there are skills. I also try to teach them how to work with understanding their brain, understanding biology. That's the beauty of the time that we're living in. So we don't have to keep repeating the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. We can turn to science and say, well, what are the strategies for actually giving my brain the downtime that it needs, given that I'm in the constraints of an educational system that maybe don't support my full flourishing as a teenager. If it were up to me, we would have an educational system that was more a reflection of what we know about adolescent circadian rhythms, and also what really matters in terms of their learning and the world that they're entering into. The system I would design would look quite different from what we have. What I tell them is, we are nevertheless living within that system and the constraints of that system. We're outside of our control. And so what can we control? You can't control how much, work a particular instructor is going to assign. You're tired, you're stressed. And so the tendency is to escape our discomfort and self-soothe, and then maybe get more behind and procrastinate more, and then it's later and are even more deprived of their sleep. So just giving them strategies for working with their stress, whether it's plunging their hands into a bucket of ice or going outside and laying on the grass for 10 minutes, or some non-sleep deep rest. I really love Andrew Huberman's podcast. I've been listening to that quite a lot, using it in my AP psychology class and elsewhere. So those are some practical strategies.
Yeah, and what do the young people do when you place them or build out that sense in them that, you have the internal, I would call signals or messaging system, the feedback loops, which can actually tell you what is good for you, what is effective. Yeah. So what do they do with that?
What I really noticed when I brought it up the other day, because we just started school, is that they gave me eye contact and they leaned forward. I got 32 kids in their desks behind masks, and they're just like looking at me, leaning forward. Tell me more about this inner wisdom. How can I get at it? And then to place them in space and time in some way that feels helpful. So to connect them, I set up my classroom in this kind of like amphitheater type arrangement, and it's also meant to look like a cave. I have like my twinkly fairy lights at the top and lots of plants and carpets, and it's all color coordinated, of course. I'm into beauty. And it's like the cave of Lascaux, so we're entering into this ancient archetype of a teacher-student relationship. It's bigger than our individual personalities within this context. We're entering into deep time. And so it's the teacher, it's myself and my students, and it's myself and my students in conversation, sacred conversation with each other, the students with themselves, the teacher and the student in conversation with ancient teachers and teachings. So stretching back through time, and then in conversation with those who have yet to be born. And what is, I've heard the seventh generation principle described a few ways. This is from the Iroquois and other tribes have employed it, or that either we make no decision without considering its impact upon 7 generations in the future, or we see ourselves as the center in a chain, the mid-generation in a chain of 3 stretching into the past and 3 moving into the future. And so we're in conversation through time. And that's one of the things that I really like to stress. is how to view our lives through deep time, through a higher vantage point.
You're frank and transparent with them about this sacred vision in the cave and the conversations you're just sharing with us right now.
I am, yeah. When I talk about my seating chart and asking for their help in arranging the seats, because it actually takes a long time to arrange the seats like that, where I can see every student, because they're not in rows, and so I'm trying to teach them how to look at everyday objects as metaphor or miracle or both.
That's beautiful. I love the juxtaposition of the very profane seating chart with the sacred cave. That's just a really nice, like, oh, we still have to do seating charts even when we're in the sacred cave. But that sacred cave image is a really, really beautiful. And I would imagine that part of being in a private school gives you the permission to presence conversation and teaching with such a richness.
It's remarkable to be able to teach what I teach, because I get to learn what I want to learn as well. And it's much more sustainable for me, shifting from social justice and peace and conflict studies to this other. I'm still at it's still the same objective, I suppose, which is healing, peace and healing and sustainability, but it's much more sustainable for me. And what were you going to ask?
No, it's great. I was actually about to go to the teaching as an extension of activism. So I like the idea of getting to the place of the transformation of your teaching subject and why that was important to you. But I'd love to start with how teaching became an extension of your activism and the spirit of your activism, and what guides you around feeling called to be an activist.
Starhawk always said the heart of an activist is born in the forest. And not long after I had moved to the Bay Area, I visited Headwaters Forest, and this was when it was being clear cut, and it was very impactful. And I had been passionate about various causes prior to that, but I feel a sense of responsibility, particularly that grows out of privilege. I have running water and electricity. I have roads. To me, this is a place of privilege. And I guess I feel fortunate enough to have landed in a vocation, which I guess is maybe a little bit contradictory to say that one landed in a vocation, but I wasn't really planning on becoming a teacher.
That was one of my questions for you was, did you have a calling towards teaching? And so I would love to know if it wasn't a calling or a plan, or how did it happen?
It happened sort of by chance, actually. At the time, I was in my last semester in college. I was at UC Berkeley, and I was working at a bookstore in Berkeley. And I thought that I was going to pursue like medical anthropology or medical sociology. I was very interested in sort of broadening conceptions of health and how that some of that broader conception might be operationalized in medical settings. So see the work of John Kabat-Zinn and the mindfulness-based stress reduction and all of the proliferation of those clinics throughout healthcare. I was also very interested in death. I had been a hospice volunteer at an AIDS hospice for a semester in the city in San Francisco in the Mission.
How old were you when you were doing that?
How old was I? 26.
And I want to stay with the teacher thing, but I just can't help but ask what the teaching was in at 26, being, somewhere in the 90s when with HIV still going pretty strong.
I was really not prepared for those encounters. The encounter with specific individuals, like men in the hospice, nor was I prepared for the encounter with my own mortality and specifically suffering, like physical pain and suffering and the loss of my faculties. It was It was a very profound experience, and I was taking graduate courses in the School of Social Welfare at the time. I knew that I wanted to study sort of spirituality and healthcare, so I was also doing religious epidemiology at UCSF in a breast cancer program there in the city. I knew that it was not my calling at that time. I actually have a renewed interest in hospice work, in death and dying.
You were talking about how much you weren't prepared for that encounter with suffering and death at that age.
That experience, it was formative. I carry it with me. I have shared one of the guided meditations, guided visualizations that was part of my training as a hospice volunteer with students on occasion, and it's been really profound for them. And I have a lesson or two in the unit on Buddhism on Maranasati or death meditation. That's certainly an important part of that tradition. Meditation upon the body in various stages of death and decomposition and eternal ground. I like to do that on Halloween, actually, and get very theatrical and dramatic about it.
And just to presence the youth, what do they do when, Ms. Armstrong comes in and drops the death meditation on Halloween?
The death meditation itself, I have not had an opportunity to do on Halloween. When I did it with my AP Psych students after the exam, they said it was their favorite experience of the year. And I've had students have pretty full-blown mystical experiences. They were going to run away from home and then they weren't going to, and
wow,
crying, like sort of just open-hearted crying about the nature of time. That's been one of the many enduring gifts of that experience as a hospice volunteer.
It's reminding me when I was a junior in high school in Southern California and I was in a psychology class, we had a guided relaxation meditation experience. And it was profound for me. It was profound for me to know that I could wakingly find myself in a state of contentment with positive visualization about my own life and my own sense of self. And I would have to say, actually, that probably seeded something in me that's still growing. But I'd appreciate the little detour into the encounter with the hospice work. But you were starting to say about intending to be a teacher. Yeah. And then you were doing this work and then somehow you left
worked
medical.
At a bookstore. Yeah.
Yes.
On the weekends. And because it was sort of like, spiritual and earthy bookstore, and they had author talks, and I started volunteering to set up chairs for the authors. And then they were like, well, I think we just need to hire this young woman. So, I had my job at the bookstore while I was finishing in school. And there was a man who'd worked there at my school. At the time, he'd been at the school for like 16 years, who also worked on Saturdays at the bookstore. And he's like, somebody's retiring in the theology department. I think he'd be great. And so 24 years later, here I am at the same school. And he retired not too long ago. I gave his retirement spiel.
So he saw something in you and said, I think you should go here and do this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he's an amazing man. He mentored a lot of kids and me.
That's beautiful. I love that. So on the activist side, becoming a teacher, you saw as an extension of your activism, but you were alluded to a couple times that the teaching the activism stopped working for you in some way. And I gather there's a lot of meat in there of experience that I'm really curious about, of course, the draw to activism, the power of activism, the investment of activism, but also realizing at a certain point maybe something else or another way. Would you be willing to walk us down that road?
Yes. One of the theologians I encountered when I was working at the bookstore is a man named Matthew Fox. And he mentioned shared his conviction that each of us has within us a mystic and a prophet. And the way I see my vocation at this time is some kind of an amalgamation I think that we are living at such a time that it's important that we remain connected to what's happening in the world and that we engage. And for the students, I want to encourage them to think very carefully about their career path. And I hope that they select a career which provides them a way of spending more and more time with the deepest part of themselves. And I have a greater trust that the deepest part of the self is also in relation to the ecosystem, the human and non-human world, and what the needs of that world are, and that we can trust that the soul will not lead us astray, in terms of what's needed at this time. Because I think it wouldn't be misaligned with what's needed at this time for a student to say, what I think I'd like to do is learn how to farm, learn how to grow food, and to live simply. We're going to need students who are thinking very carefully about the very thorny ethical issues of AI. I have several students who are interested in AI, and if we find ourselves through the uncanny valley with regard to robots that appear to be human and appear to be conscious, and we're going to need people with really strong ethical compasses to weigh in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's that my activism used to be about trying to give them experiences of awareness of various realities that were going on in the world that would engender empathy and catalyze action. And now I think I'm just I'm going about it sort of from the root, from the individual root, as opposed to sort of up on the roof shouting, look over here, the cycle of poverty and the history of redlining and retaliatory justice, and trying to get at the manifestations of some of the deeper kind of fatal flaws in our system, zero-sum rivalrous games and all of that on a finite planet, and the fact that our technology has outpaced our wisdom. So it'd sort of be pointing at all of the manifestations of that, and now I'm just sort of trying to point out wisdom. And so whatever field they pursue, if they didn't grasp the wisdom teaching on that during that lecture on that day, they at least know we've got some seed planted, that there's some source of guidance out there, which I think maybe that can help me at this point in my life when I'm in need of it, when they are in need of it.
Absolutely, when we're all in need of it at different points. I'm curious about how you came to see that change, because if I hear you correctly, Amy, what I hear is you started to see the value of investing in the psychological, moral, and ethical development in a very tangible, actionable way within. And I hear in your language a kind of a hybridization I don't hear from many people of just like biospirituality, the deep wisdom of the evolutionary essence that is actually what we also know as soul at some level, and those kind of old divisions aren't really there. So I really appreciate the intricacy of keeping that out of a polarity and keeping the the biology and the wisdom of biology as part of the resource. I mean, it's what we are, or what we wear, at least one of those two or some combination. And so, it's nice to know we can rely on biology in a certain way. And so I hear you holding that, and I hear you moving towards that kind of integrative wisdom. But I'm curious how you made that switch, and if you hit a wall, if you had a some kind of insight, and how that moved for you.
Well, the answer is mundane. It is not, I guess, by chance as well. I mean, my peace and conflict studies course didn't align with the national curriculum, and so it was not offered. And then the social justice class became more of a capstone project with a TED Talk, and there are other people running that. And the teacher who brought me in and mentored me and taught major religions for 35 years retired, and they launched AP Psych. So it was really more of an institutional shift that really, really benefited me, that really worked for me.
Yeah, how so? What did you find when suddenly you were in the new landscape, even if it was not of your own volition?
I no longer felt compelled to stay on top of the next bad news story. So, in September, when the poverty data is released, it's often actually released around September 11th, because they know that people aren't really focused on poverty data on September 11th. I can look at it, but I'm not responsible for teaching it and for updating my slide decks to reflect I've taught all the wars in the Middle East. My heart breaks for what's happening in Afghanistan now. I've had women Skype who've been part of the Afghan Women's Writing Project. They would go in secret by taxi to an undisclosed location and be given a thumb drive so they could work on their poetry, and so to know what's happening now in Afghanistan, it's heartbreaking. I've taught Syria and Afghanistan, Iraq, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, refugees. I don't have to teach all of that anymore, and it's hugely relieving for my psyche. 19 years was a long run.
Was it too long in some way? Is it 19 years too long to be in that world?
Looking back, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a long time. And it's, as someone who started teaching climate change, obviously just looking at the IPCC reports, and, would host, at the end of the unit, we'd have sort of sacred circles, and just tried to use the work of Joanna Macy as much as I could as well. It's in some perverse way vindicating for some of the work that I've done and some of the conversations I've had with students who've been influenced by, I don't know, their parents or the broader culture, and believing that climate change is a hoax, or, I'm sure that there were weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq, or what have you, things that I used to have to really document meticulously with my sources are now just common knowledge. So it's just very relieving to be able to rest in things that are more sort of ancient and less politicized. I'm really, really relieved to no longer be teaching topics that are so horribly politicized. The truth has become very politicized.
Unfortunately, that's very true. So is that the mystic? Like, are you more in a mystic phase in terms of that Matthew Fox archetypal mystic prophet?
Very much so. Very much so. Michael Meade is another kind of intellectual and spiritual mentor for me, and I love his discussion of the word weird. And I would say that I sort of embrace my weirdness, and encourage students to embrace their weirdness, because it's the sort of one foot in this world, another foot in the other world, and that idiosyncratic essence of oneself. Is the sort of archetypal meaning of it, or the original etymological meaning, as I understand his telling of it. And so, yeah, I'm kind of weird in class sometimes. Talking about, I don't know, whether it's referring to paper as creatively processed trees that enable us to describe these symbols, which we can then interpret, and then we've got these three metal rings which line up perfectly with the three hole, whatever it is. They're talking about hole punchers and binders and highlighters. But these things are miracles, right? We're not scratching out our lessons in the dirt. So let's call them what they are. It's a miracle that we have these writing utensils, these implements. We have paper. So just, Einstein, you can view the world as there are no miracles, or everything is a miracle. So I'm in that second camp, and that's, I really try to impart that as well, because cynicism is so hip, and it's not very joyful.
Yeah, no, I hear all that. Super, it's like delicious to hear you kind of talk about this creative, less burdened, and I think there's limits to the burden load, particularly with stressful, global, individually impossible to solve situations. And no, I like that you brought in Mead's work around weird, and I think in a lot of ways, if I understand his work enough, that his argument would be somewhat similar, that the solution in part lies with connecting with the weird, original, soulful, unique parts of our humanity in the face of misguided culture, as you called it. So I love all that. I think that's really beautiful, and I kind of have a sympathetic joy of happiness for you to limit your burden of the weight, and also a damn deep appreciation that you fought those intellectual detail fights for 19 years. Archetypes I work with around stress that I think are at play are the warrior and the mystic, and I realize that the warrior and the mystic are two ways we deal with stress. And we know that, like, Navy SEALs and military and athletes and high performing people know how to access their warrior and understand the actual condition that they're in and face it with a kind of preciseness and in the world as it is. And then this mystical part where we go pressureless and it's alchemical and we transform at another dimension from the weird side. And I think they're both relevant. And I think that as I hear your story, that you've moved, and it's a beautiful thing. All these chances, from the chance of being a teacher, the chance of a new class, the chance of this conversation. I'm appreciating all that.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I love teaching the warrior and emphasize that, and start with Islam and finish out the Abrahamic traditions, and then move to indigenous traditions, and then Hinduism. And all three of those traditions, the warrior is important. Whether it's the greater jihad, which is the battle fought within against one's vices, or Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita as that archetypal warrior. So I think that seems correct to me, the warrior and the mystic. And they inform one another. I think I also like to point out to the students that to consider that they are not a self. So, in becoming the best version of themselves, that the individual self is a compilation of many voices and many facets, and that we can, like family systems theory or constellation therapeutic modalities where you're in actual sort of gestalt conversation with these various facets of the self, and there's much to be learned, and it's a useful tool. I love that you're working with applying that to stress.
Absolutely. And I was right there yesterday in a conversation with my wife in a therapy session, and it was, exactly that. Like, okay, there's more than one voice going on here, more than one feeling and perspective, and they each kind of need to be heard or understood at some level. But I'm loving the wisdom part of it, and I'm loving the pattern of multiple ways that young people can begin to understand their condition and the challenges that that face them. I'm loving, I guess, in a way, the spiritual warrior. There is the street action side of things, but there's another one that I really hear you presencing in so many ways. For me, when I think about it at a very deep level, I listened to Huberman too, and I got turned on to Lisa Feldman Barrett. Have you heard her yet?
No.
Oh yeah, you should check her out.
Ooh,
She got a really beautiful book called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And it's really fascinating neuroscience. And basically, the takeaway I go is, okay, we all have a holodeck. We're all hallucinating all the time what we think is going on until we get enough pain or enough interest, curiosity to say, well, what is really going on? And that our brains are evolved for prediction. So we're modeling, predicting all the time, unconsciously sorting it out. All our emotional, mental, and physiological experiences are related to that predictive, adaptive need brains have to handle their environment. And so I know I lost my train of thought why I jumped into the Huberman. We were talking just a second ago.
The selves, and being in conversation with the selves and the holodeck.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And so the wisdom part is a lot of the solution is really at this ground level of how do we create humans and their mental models and their mental maps? And that's how I've started to see the deep self. It's not just these layers of evolution, but it's the composite story making self of engendering that. And when it's not done well, we can see it everywhere, and if it's not understood well, we can see it everywhere. But the more we can interact with each of us in our own way with ourselves, in terms of understanding the different parts of ourselves, or the different energetics are going on, our different drives, our different needs, our different ambitions, that's really helpful. It's really, really helpful to know that the old early 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s spiritual proverb, you create your own reality, has a lot of neuroscientific foundation for that. And to be able to teach young people to access that, to be able to work with ourselves, to be able to access that is really, I can't imagine, and building cultures that can actually serve that and relate with that, from the impacts of poverty and the equity issues. I mean, it's up and down the board. It's the only way. Now I'm about to almost get too limited. Not the only way, but an important way forward for having a more regenerative, experience for more human lives on this planet as we move forward.
That's beautiful. The embrace of reality is really important, right? At multiple levels, and I've really enjoyed introducing students to Robert Wright's book, Why Buddhism is True. And he doesn't use true, of course, in the theological sense, but in the sense that the claims made by the Buddha and by advanced practitioners within that tradition cohere with what we know about this kind of amalgamatory, if that's a word, nature of reality. And our stories do tend to loosen their grip, I think, or they don't stick as painfully or for as long. And so there's, I think, a greater possibility for equanimity with our experience and with what is. And I think we need to bring equanimity even to the greater crises that we face, which isn't to say that we check out, but that there are degrees of acceptance and preparation. We prepare for the ride ahead. It's going to be a ride, and to expect our model of reality to remain intact, I think, is to set ourselves up for suffering, for the suffering being, resistance to what is and what can't be avoided. So I hope that, with more and more interest in these models of reality and the brain and the intersection of neuroscience and some of these ancient descriptions of, these ancient maps, that that can more and more inform how we go about educating and reforming institutions, understanding, the reptilian brain and our tendency toward dualism and tribalism, and the work of Jonathan Haidt, I think, has been really helpful around that too. Just that we're not going to change minds by making arguments so much. It's that can be part of it. Understanding those sort of moral flavors that are informing a person's position, whether it's respect for authority and obedience, a favoring of an attitude of sanctity, or respect for freedom and care. These sort of can be these competing, like, moral intuitions or moral impulses that really, according to Haidt's work, much of that is rooted in our genetics and the presence of different neurotransmitters, whether we have serotonin or glutamate. There's no amount of rational argument that tends to be able to move that needle. So just understanding the intersection of biology and politics, biology and sociology, how groups operate internally and with it, intergroup. I think, we stand a chance of being able to craft a more supportive and sustainable path forward. I hope so.
Well, I think you just made a excellent argument for the hope I find in progressive science right now, and in terms of how biology and sociology and genetics are understood. And I think your students, and I think our communities and the communities that you serve, are lucky to have a teacher like you, as sincere and as committed to not just giving kids the basic education, but giving them the kind of deep imagination and foundation of self in order to meet, endure, confront, handle what's ahead of us, because it's going to be a lot. We all know in what ways exactly we don't. So thank you so much, Amy Armstrong, for what you do, and thank you for being on the show today. I very much appreciated having you here.
That was really beautifully said, and thank you so much, Jeff, for inviting me. I'm very honored.
Thank you so much for joining us today. All music is performed by the incredible and effervescent Chase Jackson at chasejacksonmusic.com. Please support this podcast by following us on your favorite streaming platform, sharing it with your community and friends, and by making a modest donation to our Patreon page. To learn more about this show, our guest, as well as Jeffrey and his work helping people make peace with their human nature, go to howhumanswork.us.